So let's talk about frame timing.
Yeah.
So for background, there was a previous proposal, and there's the link for it. The basic idea of that proposal was let frame start be the start of the event loop, and let frame end be the time that's captured after update the rendering. And we expose frame timing entry when the delta between those is long, where long can depend on the refresh rate of the device. Because if it's like 60 hertz versus others, then long will be different rates. So the motivation right now for frame timing is to measure how smooth the content is being rendered. And the idea is that we already have a way to measure latency of frames via event timing or user timing with measure until. So this API wants to expose more smoothness or frame throughput. And the idea is that this API will be useful to identify regressions in page rendering. For the previous proposal and for long frames in general, the idea is to capture expensive compositing work, which would not be otherwise captured in long tasks because it does not necessarily happen in the main thread. And right now, there are websites that use RAF calling to basically polyfill frame timing to detect how smoothly the content is being rendered. And that is pretty bad because it's expensive in terms of CPU and like battery life. And it also kind of violates the principles of RAF, and overall it should be avoided. So all of these things are motivations for the API.
So one thing that I was chatting with some of our graphics folks and they were raising is whether we should be looking at frames with high latency or frames that are dropped. And so this diagram is supposed to be communicating this. So at the bottom, you can see all of the frames that we kind of wish we were producing. So that's sort of what our vsyncs are. And then at the top, you can see when we're producing those frames. And so for the first two frames, say we're in a scroll, we have a touch move, and then kind of within the frame, we produce an update. And so those are quite low latency. For the third frame, it takes us a while to produce that frame. And so we just miss producing a frame. So there's one frame that we drop. And then all of the frames after that, we're taking a long time to produce. And so for kind of the last 4 frames, the ones, well, I guess it's the last, frames 3, 4, and 5, I guess are the ones you can see. It's taking 2 frames for us to produce that output. And so if you're thinking about a touch scroll, this could still be producing frames at 60 hertz. It's just that there's 32 milliseconds of latency. And that latency is already captured by event timing. And so the question would be, are there cases where you care about latency that aren't driven by input? I think probably the answer is no. And so from the perspective of a metric that's supposed to be looking at animation smoothness specifically, it may actually make more sense for us to focus on drop frames as opposed to long frames. In this particular example, the difference would be if we were surfacing long frames, all of those high latency frames, once we switched from 16 milliseconds of latency to 32 milliseconds of latency, for example, we'd be recording every single frame. Whereas if we were reporting drop frames, we would just report the one case where we switched from 16 to 32.
And is scrolling captured by event timing?
Our implementation does not do a good job of this, but we do intend to fix that at some point.
Okay.
The specification certainly allows for it. I don't know about other browser engines, but certainly Chrome is very happy to switch into what we call like a high latency mode, where we just say we're not confident that we'll be able to scroll with 16 milliseconds of latency, so we're going to add an extra frame of pipeline in and stick to 32 milliseconds of latency. And surfacing a long frame entry for every one of those frames feels like a bad outcome, whereas surfacing just you dropped a frame when you switch from 16 to 32 feels more reasonable to me.
Yeah, because it's not really, it's higher latency if you regard where they should have been produced, but if you measure the intervals, they're not longer.
Yeah.
Helps me as a web developer, helping you reason through this. Like you switched into 32 millisecond. What is the impact on web? Like what should I be concerned about?
I think, so in the case where there's input, you should care about the latency. You care about the fact that the page is not sticking to the finger as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you use event timing to capture that. If you tapped a button and then there's an animation that happens, the menu slides in, the only thing I think you care about is the one frame that you dropped as you transition from.
If it looks like it's janky, the animation, then that'll be the noticeable part to the user.
Right. That makes sense.
A couple other nice things I like about drop frames is it's a little easier to reason about changing refresh rates and that kind of thing.
Can you elaborate on the refresh rate?
Sorry, if you have a device with a dynamic VSync, then with long frames, it gets to be a little bit tricky to reason about how this frame duration longer than you thought it should be. Whereas with drop frames, it's like, did you start producing a frame? Or like, did you want to produce a frame, but you were unable to do so?
One example of that is when you plug a laptop in to a dock and then you switch monitors and you'll have a frequency switch sometimes. The web page is cool.
I have one concern with that approach of drop frames, and at least in Excel for us, getting to 60 is basically unrealistic at this point. So for us, a long frame is generally anything that's above 32 or 50 milliseconds. So we don't look much about the 60 millisecond range, 16 millisecond range for the 60 hertz. And that's also the case, as Todd says, when you switch to monitor, like presentation devices or remote desktop sessions and so on. So all those cases typically go down to 30 frames per second.
Yeah, so the way I was thinking we would present this would be we'd surface a performance entry which stated the number of consecutive drop frames. I think we would be able to still set some thresholds where you could say like, don't care about drop frames if it's just one consecutive, like just one. Only care about drop frames in a row.
Also specify the skip, the amount of skips that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think that would probably meet that use case.
Do you also have to surface the frequency transitions in some way? If
Then every color.
So if you're bouncing back and forth between 16 and 32, or
sure, yeah. So you plug in, you go to a 4 millisecond refresh monitor, super high speed, and then you unplug, and now you're back on your laptop, and then you you scroll, and now it's running code, and then your UA goes down to 32. Like those are all going to be,
right. So there's two things that the user will notice. There's we didn't produce a frame when we expected to produce a frame, and there's we skipped a frame, so we were still producing frames at 60 frames per second, but there was a frame missing, so content jumped a little bit. So this proposal currently does not cover the case where you skip a frame, which maybe it should. Is that what you're getting at?
I'm explicitly asking from the point of view of a web developer. How does a web developer reason about the difference between skipped frames at high high frequency refresh versus low frequency refresh?
Right. That is a good question. I think that question applies equally to long frames. It's still hard to reason about in that context as well. We can certainly surface some information along with the drop frame about something around what refresh rate was at that time. Well, that's a little bit, we'll take some care to figure out.
Well,
Yeah, but
I would suspect that if you were consistently seeing things at 120 and then you drop one frame or like several frames, you might still notice, even though it's still fast, that it will feel slower than what you were used to. So maybe it's okay that you expose an entry in that case, even though it's still technically fast.
Yeah, so dropping a frame if you're at 120 hertz is definitely bad, but it's not as bad as dropping a frame if you're at 60 hertz.
yeah, is the frequency exposed somehow today? Because you wouldn't expect, like, with all our scheduling and
I
the
think if you look-
scheduling story basically tells developers to care about, like, you have this many milliseconds to actually run something, but the number can vary based on the refresh rate.
Yeah, I think if you look at the interval between rafts, that gives it to you.
But it's not.
But you have to break the rule. You have to then go back to measuring rafts.
Right, so
to
we
get that.
would want to expose that information.
Our rafts, like for 120, I thought rafts are still capped for like 60 milliseconds.
I think that depends on how the browser is implemented it. I don't think that's true of all browsers today.
There was this example where like Jake's website was like snowing twice as fast or when on 120 on the
It
iPad.
does depend on the browser, yeah.
Yeah.
Firefox on Windows, if you have a 120 hertz display, we run ref at 120 hertz.
Oh, okay.
And Chrome did, at least at one point. I haven't looked recently.
Yeah, but I like, and there are no compat problems we're hitting with
I
that?
haven't heard of it.
Okay.
I don't think many people use that high refresh displays on Windows, so that's yeah.
Was it GNOME collecting use cases? Some folks at Microsoft.
Yep.
collecting use
GNOME
cases.
and EMEA both have a decent little document kind of describing how they have been measuring this.
Can I ask a naive question? So if I'm a web developer that built a naive page that simply assumes 60 milliseconds, because that's what I've read everywhere, and now it's running on Windows at 120 hertz, and boy, that's tough for my code to keep up with. That's a lot of skipped frames, frankly. How would I, coming back to Dot's question, now I have telemetry coming back, and it says like you have a ton of skipped frames. That might be really hard to figure out what's going on. I don't know what the refresh rate is, I don't know.
Right, so that's why I think we were saying we might need to.
I think we'll need to surface something around refresh rate. There's the other question of how a RUM analytics provider is going to actually surface this data. It's easy to turn drop frames into something like fraction of frames which were not dropped per second or that kind of thing. There's some nice ways of aggregating this where I think you would probably be able to see like, oh, there are a couple of users who are dropping frames all over the place, but my median frames drop per second is looking good or that kind of thing.
It's just, I guess what I'm getting at is distinguishing, is my code performing really terribly for some subset of users? Or is it that some users are just running on a much faster pipeline? Because those are very different applications.
Yep. In fact, we just heard Noam say, Excel's basically written for 30 FPS, right? So Excel wants to say, they're written to handle RAFs at faster speeds. The Excel code is not going to waste CPU usage, but they don't want to get the dropped frames.
Yeah, so it makes sense to be able for them to set the rate in which like they consider like what is long.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah, like for us, 32 is already long, and to be honest, right now we're just tracking everything that's above 50 millisecond using RAFs. So, but we will want to go down to 30, and who knows, maybe in the future we go down to the 16, but we're still very far from that.
And so that's really about the threshold of investigation rather than so that you can get good monitoring.
And it might make sense for the API to say, don't bother reporting drop frames to me unless there were 3 or more consecutive drop frames, just to reduce spam from somebody you're not going to pay attention to.
Would it make sense for an application to express its intent? Like Excel just saying, I'm aiming for 30, so that I know.
Our scheduling team has proposals floating around to just let pages say, don't bother pumping RAF at 60, just pump it at 30 FIPS. But I think that's fairly unrelated to this, although you can argue that if they say that, you should only report drop frames as if you were trying to produce them at 30 frames per second.
Yeah, and I think that's tying together two things, which is what is it you care enough about to take action on versus how do you want to be scheduled on our two separate issues.
So in terms of use cases, we shamelessly took a bunch of use cases from the doc that Microsoft folks put together and added a couple other ones here. Does it make sense for Gnome to walk through some of these?
I don't know, it wouldn't hurt, or other people in the room, there's basically a document that Excel and MSN put together showing how they currently use it and why it fails. I think I can present it right now, and then Noam can talk through it, and then yell at me to scroll.
Yeah. Do you have the latest version? I don't know if Eric merged it to the master or not.
I do, although maybe you have to present it and see that I have the ability to.
Okay, let me.
I think Nicholas has to unpresent.
Oh yeah, you're presenting. You unpresent.
I can send you a link.
Yeah, I've got it.
Yeah, so would I like to walk through this or just an easy read? So I did try to cover, if you go to the existing solution section. So I tried to cover the existing techniques we're using and their limitations. So we don't feel that the RAF callback, at least from our what we observed, is that accurate. And the main problem with that is how much expensive it is and how much it actually affects the users. So we would like, if there was a way to measuring the long frames without using RAFs, and that would be the main, that would be the ideal solution. And another downside of the RAF is if you making a RAF callback every time to do the measurement, you're essentially losing the request idle callback. You cannot leverage that because there will never be any idle time, which is another limitation in the way we optimize scheduling in our application. What else? So also another important aspect is the memory, because we need to when using graphs, we need to implement our own tracking mechanism and aggregate it in memory. I don't know if it's that much, but it is. It does consume some memory that we would like to avoid. Although, if you implement an API in native in the browser, it will consume the equivalent amount of memory. I'm presuming probably a bit less because it's a native implementation. And the last thing is when we measure frames, we only know when we had long frames, which is equivalent to the frame drops, but we don't know any cause for those long frames. We don't know if there are long tasks, and even if we're using the long task API to track long task, it's really hard to correlate between them. And to conclude that if we had a long frame and a long task inside it, then the reason was mainly a task attribution. And if there was it's hard for me to tell if there was any other reason that caused the long frame, like a rendering pipeline that is expensive and so on. So if an API can provide that, it would really help. And we just had the meeting yesterday discussing exactly that, because for us, it's really important to understand where to focus our efforts when we are optimizing the application performance. We want to know if we should focus more, put more resources on optimizing JavaScript execution or optimizing the DOM and rendering pipeline related areas. So if there was a way to basically give us hints where most of the time is spent, that would be a significant help. Does it make sense so far?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I understand correctly, so the current, so conceptually, right now, that's request animation frame to request animation frame. Right now, you just know there's a time that a frame took, but you can't break it down. The JS profiler would tell you some amount of samples about just the JavaScript, but you wouldn't be able to break down conceptually how much of the frame was JavaScript versus, I'll say, layout or garbage collection.
Right. Yeah.
Two likely subsystems.
Yeah, and that's really important for us because we are debating a lot about where to spend our time. And
so what you're asking for is to pinpoint the relevant component or code attribution that will hook into the JS profiler? Are you looking for an answer whether it was like the cause was layout, like long layouts, or GC or scripts? Or do you want a specific, like this is the function that went 10 milliseconds when it should have taken 6? No?
Oh, you're muted, Noam.
I do think that focusing at the moment on just exposing the high-level data in a reasonable way without getting too hung up on making it
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
The right call. Getting into exposing stages, the rendering pipeline, for example, is a large can of worms.
Yeah,
and I think there's a lot of value in exposing the high-level signal.
So regarding Yoav's question, so ideally, if there was a long task and we had more context about that task, the JavaScript task, then that would be great. I think there was a discussion that I missed earlier related to JS Profiling API, which covers that area, I think. regarding the other aspects that related to the rendering pipeline or any other thing that could cause drop frames, including GC or any other aspect, or idle tasks, although there are tasks, so I don't know about that. It does help us to understand the breakdown of a frame to multiple components of the frame. There's a big debate right now in at least in Excel whether we should spend our time optimizing the DOM or optimizing JavaScript. And without data, it's really hard to come to an agreement.
Okay,
So just understanding the long frames may not be enough.
Okay, but you need large buckets of attribution, basically pointing fingers either here or there rather than, drilling down to, specific causes of long layouts or whatnot, which is extremely
Well, of course, we would like everything, but if we think about moving gradually in steps, then the first step is understanding the high level granularity before we go down to the exact cause, whether a certain layout was triggered by a certain access to the DOM. That's ideal, but we're not aiming there yet, right? We want to first understand just the high level breakdown of a frame. That would really help us as well.
So browser dev tools aren't enough for you, or even, let's say, trying to use Firefox Profiler or something which gives quite accurate information. Because it sounds like you want to profile your software, and we have profilers in browsers.
Yes, we use profilers a lot, and I mentioned it in this document. The problem with profilers is that you can only use them when you have a repro of the issues that are affecting our users, and a lot of times we just don't, because they're impacted by the user content, which we don't have for privacy reasons. So a lot of time we see users having long frames, but we cannot reproduce that using a profiler. So having some more details and also ability to aggregate that information would help us.
Sorry, can we go back a bit and explain to us what are those issues being reported by the users, and what are the really sort of high level goal of these measurements you're doing? What exactly kind of problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah, so we're trying to solve two major problems. One is animation smoothness when we are, for example, in Excel, you can select a range, right? You can highlight a range that the user want to select and do something on it. So that is considered more animation-related operation because you're moving across the Excel grid, right? You're animating a rectangle, basically. And also when you're scrolling, that's another thing we consider as animating. And the other aspect is the response time. Basically, if the user has some interaction, if there is a long frame, the response would be slower as well. So we get reports from our users that the application is slow, is not responding, is stuck, and it's hard to tell from their input what exactly is happening. So we're measuring. What we started doing is just measuring long frames. We using graphs, and every time the user starts doing something, some interaction, we starting a RAF loop basically, and trying to collect if there are any long frames during that time. And then we send that data and aggregate it on our backend. The problem with that is that even if we found long frames or we have some kind of percentage of correlation between user operations to long frames, it's hard to tell what was their cause. Right? Was it a lot of JavaScript code we were running, something, or was it a lot of DOM layouts that happened at that time, and
Sorry,
things like
I
that?
have one question. So in a responsive time case, you're saying that you want to start measuring from a moment user, let's say, clicks until when that clicking operation is done, for example. In that scenario, what are you trying to measure is that whether the event was processed in a responsive fashion, or that during that time, the user clicking on something may have caused sort of like unresponsiveness or like a drop frames elsewhere now.
Yeah, it's actually both. The problem is that since we cannot continuously measure frame rate using graphs because of the reason explained earlier, CPU and battery, we actually miss the first user interaction because of that. Because only after the user interacts, we get the event, so we can start measuring. So we always have some blind spot on the initial interaction. And it's true, we can use event timing for that and try to correlate the event timing to the start of the measurement. But that's, again, it's not trivial, error-prone, and expensive on our side.
So in the ideal scenarios, you want to measure all the time of any frame that was missed.
As I said earlier, for us, any frame that is longer than 50 milliseconds seems like a good compromise for us to measure that. Even so, if we miss one frame on a 60 frame per second device, 60 hertz device, I guess we're okay with that. As Todd said earlier, for us, if it goes down to 30 frame per second, it's still reasonable from the user experience point of view. It's not a 3D gaming application that needs the 60 frame. The users don't notice that much. We actually did some experiments. The users don't notice if they're on a 60 or 30 frame per second device.
So the concrete examples you gave were all driven by user input, I think. It wasn't clear to me why event timing wouldn't address those use cases.
The event timing would just give us indication how long it took for the callback, I guess, to arrive.
No,
right?
but event timing plus measure until that was presented this morning while you were sleeping.
Yeah. Actually, I was running, but yeah.
Was it, are these input events being handled asynchronously? So event timing does give you the time until the next paint, which I think is all you need for most of these use cases.
So how far into the future do you care after the event handler callbacks are run? Like, do you handle whatever you need to display in the callbacks?
So the way we implemented it is, again, a compromise of the constraints. So we after we get the event, we set a timer for 5 seconds. And then we assume that if a user started interacting with the UI, it may interact a bit more. So we have a time window for 5 seconds where we measure the frame rate using the ref loop. And then we stop registering refs for that. Now, if the user done any interaction during those 5 seconds, then we extend the window for another 5 seconds until the user is basically stopped interacting with the application.
Yes, it sounds like the fact that you start measuring after click is more incidental thing because of limitation with the RAF. You have to do that to minimize the power loss. But I think in ideal world, if you could always measure it, you would always measure it, right?
Yeah, ideally, we wouldn't want even to have a specific code that is related to the user interaction, right? We would just want it to always be measured. And if we have frame drops or a frame that is longer than 30 or 50 milliseconds or whatever threshold we set, we will get some kind of a callback that we can, or an entry in a resource that we can look into later and aggregate it.
Yeah, but to clarify, do you expect any frame drops that are not related to user input? Because it seems like event timing or event timing plus measure until can solve your use case of measuring how long things take.
I've got one for you, Noam. It's when another user edits the spreadsheet, and therefore
Okay.
Yeah.
the single
Yeah.
causes a
Yeah.
replay.
That's true. So I mentioned earlier that we start this timer when we have a user interaction, but it's not the only case. We also have internal events in our system when we have external. We call them like external events, where one example is when we have co-auth scenarios where multiple users are active on the spreadsheet and they changing their selection ranges and performing edits. And there's also some scenarios where some properties of the documents change, or when there's some how is it called, extensibility APIs, where users have their own code that may run and then returning results or updating the content of the document. So it's not only user or live user interaction related events.
So is it fair to say that how Excel is using this API, right now, Excel is using refs as a way to correlate with other tags on other features to say there are certain features that tend to cause slow user experiences. Is that accurate, Noam?
Yeah, well, what we can do is heuristically infer that when we tracked that a certain operation happened, we observed long frames in proximity to that. Right? We don't have the exact causation link there. So it's basically a heuristic-based exercise where we use statistics mostly. And for many cases, it actually works on large data. If you have millions of samples, you could probably get good heuristics, but it doesn't give us the complete solution. And we know we have a lot of blind spots of things that we miss or incorrectly conclude that they are causing or contributing to long frames.
So if you had the ability to get long frames or skipped frames, some concept of long frames, and
Right.
you could just enable that as a performance timeline or performance observer feature at nav time, would that help get you more samples? What is it? What's the?
Yes, I think if we had it like the long task API style, I guess, if we had a way to really understand when we have long frames all the time, and we could decide whether we want to track them or not using our own sampling logic. But if we had all the time, regardless of the user input, that would really help us, because we could add additional markers to indicate what's happening in the application at any given moment.
Right. Yeah, the only thing is, right now, we don't have any concrete proposal to add attribution, which was mentioned earlier. So it would depend on your to identify the potential causes of these long frames. Because adding attribution for long frames seems pretty complicated.
Yeah, I understand. The attribution is not the key, as long as we know that we can capture everything. And I wouldn't say that attribution is not important for us, but we do have some ways to work around that.
Right. But I do think even without the attribution, with your markers and the fact that you're already ref calling when it's actually the most sensitive in terms of performance for the website, like after user input or when syncing, then I think it would probably be a useful API for Excel, but like hard to tell from like in advance.
So I heard you say no. Basically, if you do, the key thing that you're looking for as the highest priority is to remove your dependency on request animation frame as a way to detect long frames.
Yes.
And then secondarily, figuring out how to get better attribution at runtime is the second core ask. Is that correct?
That's good. That would be secondary. Our highest priority is to basically collect more data so we can have better analysis on our user experience. And we actually limited in collecting data because of the RAF loop, both because of we're limiting to time slots during user session, and also we want to impact least amount of users, so we're using very aggressive sampling. So we're getting very few, or it's still a lot of data, but we get a subset of the data we would like to collect.
And both MSN and Outlook.com use a similar technique and are limited from their detection of long frames. And both of them are using this technique for identifying bad ad IDs, aka ads that are shipped by various networks that are being shown to cause long frames. And they then use correlation as a way to then give feedback not to load those ad IDs again.
So one question is, are they able to detect these bad ads even when they are out of process?
It turns out that they can, because on a busy system, the overhead of those other processes will cause sufficient impact on the performance of the main process that negative impact.
So, yeah, I think for the Excel use case, long tasks, it should be sufficient until proven otherwise. Like, I think if you have skip frames on apps like Excel, the vast majority of problems will be on the main thread. So they should be reflected in long tasks. If something is happening at later stages of the pipeline, I think that's a lot rarer, and I would like to see some proof first. And that proof can be collected by having a profile that shows, okay, the problem is actually on that other thread. And profilers give that information.
It's tricky too, because it's not just, like, you can have problems just on the main thread,
Yeah.
where you have a long task and then a long wrap. And like, each of those tasks aren't long enough to trip any thresholds, but the sum of the work required to produce the frame.
Oh, and you don't know if you painted in between? Is that the problem? Because if you do know, then you can just combine those two long
Well,
tasks.
remember that long tasks is only surfaced if the task is greater than some threshold.
Of course, yeah, okay, yeah.
Right,
Okay,
so potentially reducing the threshold of the long tasks might help with
Yes.
that, right?
Yeah.
But, hold on, but in that case, you can still interleave, like, if you have like a dozen small tasks that add up to like, let's say more than 20 milliseconds, right? The browser could choose to pick in the middle and render it anyway.
Yeah, it depends on the task. Like, if it's things that have to happen, if half of it's RAF and half of it's not RAF, like the RAF stuff still has to run when you're going to pump a frame, assuming that you run RAF like Chrome does.
So the render steps are, all of the render steps are per spec required to run prior to the paint. And so you can't interrupt any of them.
Yeah, so I think sure, yeah. Oh, by the way, the frame thing got all sorted out, so all the browser implements the prompt timing. So I think it would mean that the most one frame, right? Because there could be one task that is like, let's say 10 milliseconds, and then there's another like RAF that takes like 5 milliseconds, right? And then the rendering doesn't happen.
I believe that's the case, yeah.
I don't think you can have like two tasks that then add up to like 20 milliseconds and then RAF and these 2 frames. That's not gonna happen, right? So I think this would be only an issue where you have one task and then RAF that's taking long, then you may not capture that.
If we're just talking main thread, then yes, I agree. And then we should also get some data on compositing stuff being an issue.
Right, well, Yeah, I mean, except we don't know about it though, so I mean, for us, that's sort of like, yeah.
And so from our perspective, you get a pretty big win from having this be a browser API, even in terms of quality over using the RAF signal, because we could get like signals very late in the pipeline. Like the GPU might say, oops, I didn't have time to pump out that frame, and we would be able to surface that. Whereas I suspect that would not be the case for Safari.
So let me go back up to actually something, this right here caused MSN.com to be the #1 battery consuming a website in Microsoft Edge on laptops when they had the request animation frame protection enabled, because they were using their RAF technique to find skip frames, and for 4 to 5 months they were eating users' batteries, and they would not have done that with the existence of.
In this case, would it be helpful to have some kind of passive RAF? So right now, RAF is basically active. You ask, you call by request.
Request. It's in the name. Yeah.
Yeah, but
I'm reading it.
you would have some kind of passive that you
Yeah.
don't request, but you just get once browser actually paints next time.
You're saying effectively, could you replace the idea of drop frames with the idea of only run this code when there is actually going to be render stuff, or something rendered.
So this is tricky for 2 reasons. One is just long periods of time where we aren't producing frames because there's nothing to produce. And so you need to handle that appropriately. And there's also
the most issue with that. You just have the callback somewhere and you call it once.
but how do you distinguish between a frame that took forever to produce and a frame where there was a long delay before we produced an additional frame?
Why wouldn't you use long tasks then? Same problem with lots of small long tasks?
So if we're trying to distinguish between, we have a 10 millisecond task and a 10 millisecond wrap. So we missed a frame. How do you distinguish between that case and the case where we didn't produce a frame because there was no content to update?
I see.
And then the other thing that plays into this is visited links, where we can't expose whether or not a frame was produced.
So shall we go back to?
Visited links or cross-origin same process iframes, either way. And I also, it's possible that having the reduced data volume where we're only surfacing the cases you're actually interested in instead of every case, maybe there's some value there.
I have a second comment. For the general problem where users are hitting performance problems and then you can reproduce them, we have a similar problem in Firefox. And in our case, using the Gecko profiler works. Because in a report from a user, we can ask that user, oh, please can you capture a profile for us and share it to us? And then we can see that profile. So I suggest we into that if there is a communication channel to that user. And usually
that's not.
users are technical enough to report the problem, they are also technical enough to capture the problem.
So
Yeah, well,
Excel to implement an Excel profile that users will click and.
No,
That's really sorry. It's there are a variety of reasons. A lot of them related to regulation on why we cannot actually contact a user and ask him why to give us a profile and to tell us that things are slow. You don't need to be that technical, I guess, and that's coming through automated anonymizing system. We cannot contact our user asking them. Well, some user we can, but a lot of time that's not the case.
All right. For us, the initial hurdle is higher because people need to create a Bugzilla account and then find a bug in the right place and so on. But yeah, okay.
Yeah.
One concrete question that we had later on in that deck was for analytics providers. Do you have any thoughts on how they would present data on bad animations?
Yeah, so like what we do today is we use request animation frame for a short amount of time during download, just to kind of get a general FPS, if you will, of the page load event. We can optionally turn on the same type of recording during other user interactions if the site wants to. We do also report a average frame time. Just kind of another way of saying
And
that.
so during like onload, for example, what would you actually surface about that? So you have a series of deltas.
Yeah, it'd be just one number at the end, which would be just overall kind of average frame rate. We are also tracking the deltas individually to show on an individual basis if you want to go back and look at that session in particular, like along with all your other resources, kind of in a waterfall DevTools kind of environment. Here's the frames that were presented for that kind of purpose, but otherwise it's really just what kind of one magic number can we present, and we're not even really confident that's really helpful. But
Do you think that something like drop frames or long frames would be more valuable?
They're more actionable. It's more probably indicative of bad periods or janky periods or parts of the transition that you would want to improve. So.
And you think that your users would use that data if it existed?
If they can figure out how to fix it.
Yeah.
Similar to long tasks where it's just kind of a number, a metric that they can track. Now, it is helpful in aggregate when you're looking at, deploy of one version versus the next version, to see if what got worse, that kind of thing. But unless they're tracking that very specifically, it can be frustrating for them to, what do I do with this data? So I think that's why we don't get a lot of interest in it right now because of that. Similar to long tasks.
And that the data is not actionable.
Yeah.
Is there any other slides that?
So, what I heard was that the current proposal is for dropped frames, but is there a full proposal or is that just the current thinking?
That is very recent thinking that I had to draw something up on. I'm interested if folks think that drop frames seems like a better alternative to long frames. Or if folks have any thoughts on that. I think Ryosuke's comment that drop frames, the ability of different browser vendors to determine if a frame was dropped or not is not consistent.
Well, how would you define a drop? I guess that's the core question is if you can spec the start and the end for where you would record and then.
Right. So in very rough English, I would say a drop frame is where you wanted to draw something, but no pixels ended up hitting the screen.
The browser made a decision. Oh, not this time. Oh, I see. And or it chose to effectively. Yeah, I understand how Apple ends up in a funny spot. Okay.
Yeah, because especially in variable frame rate situation, right? Like what does that mean? That you expected that frame? Maybe you were not expecting anything.
Does it make sense to measure the length of frames from the previous one rather than the point in time where you originally expected them, but they never arrived? So that in the scenario that Nicholas showed, the first one will be 32, but everyone after that will be 16.
Yeah, we could look at frame intervals instead. I think that's more confusing in cases where your frame rate is changing back and forth.
Okay.
But it's similar in the normal case. It's also weird when you have those long periods where we weren't producing frames, but I think you would spec it as though you're just constantly producing frames.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the previous frame is also awkward if you had like a minute of duration between single frame to another frame.
Exactly.
No, of course it's the previous frame in cases where you would have produced a
Yeah.
previous frame, but it was.
And that's one thing that's
dropped.
nice about drop frames is you never have to refer to the previous frame, assuming that you can find the right spec.
Yeah, I think anytime you refer to the other frame than the one you're talking about, things get super confusing, right? Because the rate may have changed in that time. And also, there's no guarantee that there's such a thing as a previous one.
Does it at least make sense for us to take a serious pass at trying to figure out what drop frames would look like and then get feedback from other browser vendors on whether or not that makes sense? Or should we be focusing more on length of frame like the previous proposal?
Well, if I understand the use cases, at least as I understand the use cases I've heard, are all about correlating action within a duration of a frame. So if you're going to do drop frames, you're still going to need the concept of when's the range in which the drop frames happen to allow that correlation.
We would certainly surface the time at which the frame was.
The first drop frame time.
I was gonna say the time at which the frame was dropped, but that doesn't actually make any sense. We will come up with some reasonable timestamp to associate with those entries.
And is drop frames conceptually all about the compositor thread? Or is it also about because you get into that interesting, well, if every single frame has the same delay, you will impact the feeling of input for the user. But I think the intent you're saying is that event timing would be how you would measure that. Would you only use this to measure when animation smoothness issues are happening?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but then
Does that cause web developers to have to pay attention to more things than they want to? Sorry, is there a way to say, hey, you only pay attention to one thing and you can probably get a read on both?
The trick is not penalizing cases where latency doesn't matter.
Correct.
So for example, you just got a CSS animation of a spinner. You don't really care about what the latency of the spinner is. And so the web developer does need to care about latency in latency sensitive cases and throughput in the non-latency sensitive cases. So I don't think we can get away with only caring about one thing.
Yeah, the latency is more or less covered by event timing.
Exactly. Yeah.
That makes perfect sense to me.
I think it makes sense. I don't know how much website developers are ready to process that. But it's accurate.
I think, thinking more carefully, I think if we went the route of drop frames, we might need to basically repeat our feedback, which is that we may not know what the drop frame means. Like, I think.
Do you think, so you would at least know on the main thread when you were unable to produce a frame?
No.
No, not even on the main thread? Huh.
If you've changed your painting loop to rely on the flow model, aren't you in control of it?
You know when you're sending a frame from the main thread to your compositing architecture. And so you can say, we tried to do, like, we would have wanted to do this at time X, but we did not do that, right?
But I think the problem is we don't know what the time by which we want to finish the thing.
Right. You don't know the deadline, you don't know if you missed it. Yeah. And so you could have some rough approximation, but it's possible the rough approximation there is strictly worse than something around frame intervals.
I mean, well, I think in some cases we don't even know what the rough approximation is because we don't know how fast the screens try to update.
Yeah.
What about the concept of long frame? Does it?
I mean, I think the website specifies it super clear. This website saying, oh, like default any, a rendering update which took more than 50 milliseconds. Sure. That's within it.
I
think the interesting duration that we could report on is the interval between the scheduling the rendering update and the end of the rendering update. So some work that triggered a style change that requires rendering, and then to the end of rendering, we can measure that. But that doesn't mean there was a bunch of JavaScript probably in the main thread like before you scheduled the rendering step, which is still possible. Yeah.
I think we may need to think more about this and faster Safari folks about what we can come up with that works. I think the other piece that's, I think, missing here is use cases doc has some great sort of high-level use cases, but I think trying to get some more like really concrete examples of this specific widget on this specific website needs frame timing for the specific reason.
I think the WebPerfWG use case as a face-to-face update ads, the presentation's there. And that's pretty compelling in terms of voice rate usage.
Yeah.
What would be an example of a specific use case? Because I would be happy to provide specific use case. I'm not sure what level of granularity you're referring to.
Yeah, I think just having something where you can actually kind of, based on the description, you can kind of understand this is the widget that has the problem. It's very specific to what the user is actually trying to accomplish on the site.
So would an example be, for example, in Excel, showing a couple of screenshots of someone else is editing the document, and here's the first screenshot, and then here's another screenshot after the user edits the document, and we're trying to measure if this code is getting the DOM updates and all the updates without skip frames, something along those
That
lines.
sounds perfect.
To really spell out exactly a couple of key user actions. And then the MSN ad.
I think those use cases was basically the same as the ads use case.
Yeah, they're both correlation use cases. Excel is doing more work because they have to then correlate to actions to then say, hey, there are certain actions that are triggering more frames dropped, and then they have to go do, way more digging. Whereas the MSN case is simple correlation because they have a direct component to turn on and off.
Okay. So.
Thanks for all the feedback, folks. I think we've got our work cut out for us.
It sounds like you guys are in favor of the idea that, hey, websites are really measuring it, and they are actually finding things to make better or worse based on request animation frame already. Is that something, because there are multiple websites doing that already. It's just how do we replace it with a web API that's going to be the right web API in all the browsers.
Yeah, I think the use case seems pretty complete, right? You have a slow frame.
Mm-hmm.
You want to solve that. I mean, in native apps, you have tools like instruments to measure that. I could see you probably want to do that too. But I think the really question is, can we come up with something that's useful?
Yeah.
That's actually implementable.
Yeah, it can't be too high level because then you don't get anything out from the API. It needs to be quite low level. You need to be precise enough.
Okay, cool. So we're a bit ahead of time. So we added a bunch of things from tomorrow morning where we had sessions that were overbooked. So we moved them to now. Nick, do you want to talk about resource timing visibility?
Good. I was going to work on some slides tonight. I could wing it if you want.
You can just make it now.
It's like live coding versus live presenting.
Right, exactly. Yeah, doesn't matter. I can do either way. Well, it's just somebody else that wants to.
Yeah, how about other topics?
I have LCD implementation experience. So.
Yeah, so I was wondering what kind of questions there about.
I'm trying to remember the context.
Yeah.
Ben
asked.
Yeah, I can also give some additional background. So there was one teleconference where LargestContentfulPaint was proposed, and then there was some discussion about, oh, we're putting so many heuristics in the browser without really knowing, are these heuristics useful or valuable? And then there was, I think, another email on the mailing list from Giles, and he said, well, we don't really have any information that this is related or that this correlates with users' actual experience. And now that we have it shipping, it would be nice if we could know if there is more evidence in that direction that it correlates with actual user experience.
Before jumping in there, like, is anybody aware what the LCP is?
Anyone not familiar with largest contentful paint?
Well, I would like a quick summary.
I can provide that. So the idea is first contentful paint surfaces the first like image or text that is drawn, but obviously that's often not going to be particularly representative of user experience. Largest contentful paint is a slightly more complicated heuristic, which gives somewhat better results, which looks at either the largest image or largest block of text, whichever is bigger, or a block of text is defined as the lowest level block element or something along those lines. So we just look at whichever of those is bigger and then surface the time at which that element was drawn.
And you just look at the first one, so it's the first big thing that paints.
So we don't report immediately. So if we see something big and then later we see something bigger, we will report the bigger thing. The heuristic around when we report is either when the user navigates away or when there is discrete user input.
Next one.
Like clicking,
Scrolling mouse.
scroll mouse, okay, yeah,
Because it changes what's in view.
right, yeah. In terms of gathering data to know that it's good, most of our research did not depend on shipping the API. Most of our research was done in the lab, getting film strips and examining large quantities of film strips, comparing to various metrics. I think last time we talked about this, we said we should really present some of those sometime, and then we still haven't gotten them to a point where we can present them, and that's silly.
I mean, there are some public slides.
There are a small number of public slides which we'd be able to show.
Yeah.
Can we ask questions that might help you narrow down some of those results?
Yeah.
Like when we were discussing this, we were talking about you had excluded background images, for instance, in the heuristic.
The excluded background images are only for those that are background of the body.
Right. So I was questioning that decision. I'm just kind of curious to see some correlation about like why you did that, and is it actually useful?
Right.
Well, excluding background of the body. So
As the largest.
We did see a number of examples where it's fairly common for the body
Yes.
to have a background that is a big image.
Yeah.
So in film strip analysis, we saw a non-trivial number of cases where that was being flagged as the largest contentful paint. We could probably dig up a very rough fraction. We could certainly dig up examples. But it was a large enough fraction that it stood out to us as not acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, we're still not really getting data, but I was, because I wanted to see like, that's your expectations,
Right.
doing it, but then in the wild, when web developers are trying to use this, like, is that assumption still valid? Basically?
The assumption that those paints are not like real content
Right.
should be considered
Right.
large contentful
Yeah,
paint.
exactly.
Yeah, or that higher numbers on this metric, or let's say that lower numbers on this metric correlate with better user opinion about a website.
well, that's
So not just looking at the screenshots and saying, yeah, this seems reasonable, but actually doing the research with users. Did this page actually feel faster?
Yeah,
So I might be setting too high a bar here, but it would be awesome to have this.
Maybe user engagement metrics in correlation with LCP scores.
So we have put some amount of effort into user studies here with very little success. That's not to say that we could not put in more effort. But I think if you want proof that it correlates well with user experience, we're gonna have a hard time coming up with that. If you want proof that it does better than First Contentful Paint, we can definitely come up with that.
Yeah, that's a low bar though. We want a little higher bar.
I agree that it's a low bar.
Yeah.
But it is also like the best thing web developers have right now. I think element
That's an
timing.
assertion, but yeah.
Yeah, element timing is definitely going to be better than Largest Contentful Paint for the cases where web developers are willing to annotate their page. But for cases where users are not willing to annotate their page. So what data should we be?
So well, again, looking at the background, like I'd like to see correlation on that. The other question when we were first talking about this.
Let's focus on that example just as something that's maybe easy to talk about. Is anecdotal data reasonable, or like how?
I would like to not have anecdotal data.
So it's unclear to me how we would automate the process.
Yeah,
Do you have any user studies, for instance?
So, Nick here has business metrics, as well as, I'm guessing you are collecting LCP?
Yeah, start, well, when we starting.
Yeah, it's like once it's.
So we could revisit this in like 4 or 6 months or whatever when you've got data.
Would that be?
That would be very useful. That's what we're looking for. Yeah.
That's what we're hoping
But that's
to
Yeah.
sort of
do.
anecdotal, right?
No, it doesn't.
No, it's not
Yeah.
anecdotal. You
It's
have the
correlated
same-
with business.
Yeah.
It'll be
Yeah.
for our customers to define their conversion rate and stuff like that, bounce rate, that kind of thing. Being able to correlate LCP and.
Okay, great.
That
Yeah.
won't address.
That's what I'm looking for. Yeah.
That won't address your specific concern of background images.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I was, those heuristics for that, I question, and then the other thing from the initial presentation would be, text-heavy sites like Wikipedia, and the algorithms that we were saying, this text, no, this text,
Yeah.
like, that still seems very hand-wavy to me.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that we should do this or like this should be the criteria, but for example, you could imagine, let's say you have some criteria like the text, wait until the text is painted, image is painted. You could imagine an experiment where you delay everything, painting of everything else artificially. You just modify browser to do that and then show that to the user. And does it feel the same when there was an extra delay on the other painting?
I mean, it's obviously not going to feel the same though.
No, like, do you feel the page will be slow? I mean, if the user thinks that will be slower, maybe that should be taken into account. I mean, because I think in order to decide whether background image is, for example, relevant or not, right? Like you have to decide whether like a delay in the background image painting would affect the page or not.
Well, and
Like,
we're
that's-
not trying to claim that this
It's not the
metric.
same as asking whether the background image is the most relevant content or not, right?
Yeah,
That's the real question.
it's probably relevant, it's not necessarily the most relevant. And that can basically vary, like maybe the entire page is just implemented as a background image.
Yeah, so once we have this data, suppose we have a number that says, here's the correlation. We can say it's better than FCP, it's not great. I can almost guarantee you that's what we're gonna see. How do we actually make a decision based on that?
Can we OT, like, here's LCP version 1.1 as an origin trial that can be tested on some site. Yeah, but origin trials don't really work for
I
that
think that's
case.
the question that Tim is asking.
Yeah.
It's not how you obtain the data, it's once you have the data, what's the
Yeah.
bar?
Yeah.
So certainly we've done a bunch of some internal correlation studies with LCP and that kind of thing. The most recent one, which not that speed index is a great metric, but of the metrics that we've got, LCP correlates most strongly with speed index. Maybe that means something, maybe it doesn't. It doesn't correlate great. In all of these cases, it's very difficult to understand what a number, like when you boil a correlation down to like the Spearman coefficient, what does that mean? Is it good? Is it not? it's hard to make decisions based on that.
I mean, I think that the trouble here is that this is more or less heuristics, right? And we're deciding is the heuristics good or not. Yep. I mean, I think
in a blind way too.
right. Yeah. I mean, that makes me a bit uneasy.
Yeah, it makes me very uneasy.
Yeah.
Like, we can do a better job of surfacing anecdotal data, certainly. Like the film strips, from my perspective, you look through 100 film strips, 200, 300 film strips, you get a bit of an intuition as to the quality of the metric. It's an intuition, it's fuzzy.
Yeah.
Like, I think more interesting question is, like, let's say you didn't have this particular algorithm, right? You had some alternative algorithm. If you had two algorithms, what would be the criteria by which you would decide which one is better, right? Like
In that case, I think something like the correlation data would be quite reasonable. Correlating with next business metrics.
Well, I would actually ask about the business metrics next. And, because there's a difference between business metrics and user performance, whether or not those two things are the same is, so it's a piece of data that's super valuable. But the specific question that was asked was, how closely does LCP map to the perception of user performance?
Right.
Which is actually, that's why he brought up user studies. The trick part is, though, across sites, LCP will be perceived differently. So let's say there's the top 50 sites, we just grab screenshots of all of them and then say, does this site feel better? Does that site feel better? If an LCP is greater on one site than another site, do people say the lower LCP site is more performant? And the answer is, it's probably apples and oranges, right? And
yeah, but right now we don't even have like data to give web developers that would say like, oh, this is the type of web content or site that like LargestContentfulPaint might be useful for. Like we don't even have that right now. Well, like if you were just saying that like LargestContentfulPaint could vary radically between sites, depending on content.
Sorry, what I was saying is that LCP, when you think about it,
effectiveness of perceived performance in terms of being effective at.
I'm saying that there is more to perceived performance than LCP, that the way that page displays, the ordering, there are more things to how a page feels than the magic number.
Right.
And I have not seen sufficient studies of performance to give us a feel for that. But within the same site, then the question would be, well, what if you, I think somebody was saying, inflate LCP a little, that would be a user study. Can you play to show the exact same page where you've messed with the browser to slow down chunks of the page? That would show you a longer LCP on the same content. That's the type, is that the type of user study that you're looking at as a way to?
That would make, because that would at least get away from some of the fuzzy.
It's unclear to me what you do with that data, though. Like, slowing down a web page, it's going to make users sadder to some degree. Like, again, it's a question of we don't know what is good here.
Well, I think the reason I suggested was because let's say like, you slow down the painting background image, right? And then let's say you had a sample like I said, 20 pages. And if you bit that across the page, turns out the user perceive on average, let's say the page was 5% slower, right? And then let's say you, on the other hand, took the background image into account and then sold on something else, like maybe text painting. And then on the average, user perceived that in that case to be slightly faster than in the
How
case
do you
of
collect
background.
that user perception? That's the.
That's some people like.
Asking users has certainly not proved particularly effective in our experience.
Oh, okay.
I know Gilles has done some of that.
Yeah, I also know of a study by Microsoft that they did on Bing where they slowed things down on purpose to see what would happen on search results. And they discovered that in the section of users that were slowed down, after they stopped the study, it took weeks for their usual click-through rate on ads to recover. Like, people were pissed off for a while for having a bad experience, even though it was back to normal. So you have to be very careful with slowing things down and the effect it has on people's opinion of the website. it's really not a good proxy for what would happen if it got faster at all. So be careful with that thinking. I don't think it's a good method. It's been proven to actually kind of be counterproductive to do that.
Thanks.
That's good to know.
So the clear thing we can do is show, like, provide the group with a bunch of film strips. That I think we should be able to do. Past that, I haven't heard any proposals that seem particularly convincing to me. Like, we can certainly quantify how good it is with a number.
We said speed at X, you did correlations with speed X, right?
Yeah. If folks, I can surface some concrete numbers on that.
That'd be great.
The depressing piece there is that of our metrics that we had, the order of correlation with speed index was largest contentful paint, then onload, then FCP, which I didn't feel great about. But yeah, so we can surface that data.
That'd be great.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
On the quick side, it seems like a good way to find whether largest contentful paint is a good proxy for, did this page load quickly and draw quickly and now I see what I want to see, is to take a large number of sites and have the original site author annotate what's the most important thing to draw, and then compare that metric with our largest contentful paint or various chain.
So element timing, and like once people start annotating element timing, we can see how often wrong are we.
The only trick there is what fraction of people using element timing will annotate precisely one element, and if they annotate more than one element, how do we disambiguate which one is most important? Maybe we say we win as long as we guess one of them. I don't know.
Yeah, but like once adoption of element timing grows in the wild, I think we'll have a better way of correlating our guessing, our heuristics about this with what the actual original author intended to be the most important thing.
I agree.
Although that commentary might also mean that the element timing needs to have some mechanism to say, oh, like include this as a part of the initial painting. Right.
I think there's a fairly broad assumption being made that website developers understand how their users perceive performance, which I think is Gilles, his study effectively asserts.
I mean, we were very far from knowing that, very, very far. And in my experience, I think there's been an over-focus on the initial rendering of the page. And I think the answer lies beyond. People's perception is not formed just on the first hundreds of milliseconds of the experience. Is the whole thing. And so I think this largest contentful paint might be useful for websites who wants to kind of separate ads from their own content kind of automatically, assuming that they have something that's bigger than the ads. It's not always the case on the first rendering of the page. That's the only that's the main value I see. So it's useless for Wikipedia because we don't have ads. And it tends to be, all these new metrics about initial paint tend to be all very close to each other. Because if you have already a reasonably fast website, it tends to be that most of the stuff that's above the fold is going to appear all at once. If you've been very diligent about making things lightweight and shipped in the right order. In that sense, you're kind of splitting hairs, looking for new metrics in that area because you already have a very good idea of when that happens. And from the studies I've done, they're fairly poorly correlated to user opinion about performance. So I would say it has some use. The question is, we have to figure out how many websites care about that wouldn't otherwise use element timing, which I think is a far superior solution to that problem space.
And I definitely think that Wikipedia is not the target audience for this. For pages that are willing to do the work of annotation, element timing is clearly superior. But for people who are just pulling in a random analytics provider.
What I'm saying though is you have to be careful. Like, I think of, for example, of newspaper websites where often you have giant ads appear that are much bigger than the actual content people care for, and that's what largest contentful paint will end up measuring sometimes. And so you have to, I think you have to.
They would be iframed, so you.
Not necessarily. Well, I don't know. It depends. I think there are different techniques to show those things, but yeah, I mean, all I'm saying is that you have to be like, have you looked at this in the real world? Like, is it always actual content from the website most of the time?
Certainly not always, but I would say most of the time.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I can say that for Excel, the LCP would probably measure the skeleton content we show before we start loading the actual content, because that's sort of an image. So it would not measure the user experience for the real content the user is interested in. For that, we will have to probably use the element timing.
So probably a common issue for SPAs, right? That tend to show skeleton thing before the actual data.
Yeah, so we do have yet another heuristic around identifying what we consider splash screens. So if the largest image is removed before any user input occurs, we say that looks like a splash screen, so we're not going to count it, which will handle some of those cases. It certainly won't claim that it handles all of them. And I certainly wouldn't claim that LargestContentfulPaint is going to do the right thing in all cases. Like, it is heuristic driven. Element timing is the correct solution for people who really do want accurate data, but for developers that are not willing to put the effort into annotation, I think it's.
But how easy to spec has that been? Or has this part been spec'd yet? Like, how you determine what you discard?
The removed element part is.
We do have a spec up. I don't think we've gotten particularly thorough review from other browser vendors at this point. But we do have a spec.
Yeah, and a review would be highly appreciated.
And also, I would like to add that, again, element timing works in a lot of websites, but for some websites where we don't control what's there, it doesn't work, and LCP is the best. Once it works in a SPA, it will be fantastic.
I certainly think that the thread on the WebPerf mailing list, certainly lots of web developers are interested in a heuristic-based approach here.
Do you have data that will enable you to
so
correlate LCP scores to something user satisfaction?
I think so. So not right now because we are a web app, so LCP will not work. Will not give relevant data for us. But once it works with navigation start that we talked this morning, we will, because for us we use the main thread as an indicator that the page is done. So when it's idle, we say, okay, that's it. It took 700 milliseconds or 2 seconds. And hopefully this will match with LCP. In other words, like if we assume that the last paint is close to the last JavaScript activity, we'll be able to correlate if that's true. And if it's not, we'll see what extra JavaScript we are doing. But yeah.
Anything else on LCP front?
Maybe just one comment on the link intent to ship thread. There is a couple of links to presentations with film strips that provide some of the background, but it sounds like we could publish more.
Yeah, we figure out what our workflow is like for publishing those. I don't really know what we should do in there, but the correlation data should be easier to get out to later.
Do you have data on the variance of LCP for same domain across instances and how it compares to other metrics?
I believe we did do a variability study on LCP, but I don't remember the details. Certainly,
the data in the lab would be great.
That's true to some degree. The other piece is all of our point in time metrics, like FCP, I'm sure LCP, they tend to distribute multimodality. So just any single point in time metric is likely to be kind of noisy. Again, it's a question of like, if we had that data, how would we interpret it to say if it's good or not?
Well, it's kind of like, it would be interesting to see if you can statistically prove that it's different. Like there is noise in all of those, but can you demonstrate that it's actually different than say FrameTiming?
Sorry, LCP is different from FCP? Yeah.
Yes, accounting for the noise. Is it statistically different when you look at enough websites?
We did do some analysis of that sort, and it definitely is much larger than FCP reasonably frequently. And we should be able to share some data on that.
Well, actually, the core question I was getting at is I suspected there was multimodal variance. And if any of those sites that have some really great like chunks are also sites that happen to collect user happiness data, there's the potential for them to correlate these multimodal with LCP to gather you information about the, does this actually have something? Right. The trick is, it's just a really hard thing to get right in an origin trial. So it's a heuristic-based thing is really hard to measure, I think is.
And I would say even non-heuristic-based things, evaluating whether or not they're any good is very difficult also. And I feel like for first paint and first contentful paint, there was basically nothing. And so we were quite willing to accept that, like, sure, we have no evidence this metric is good, but we're reasonably happy to be shipping it.
I guess the question is, if there are any other API where API is basically heuristics.
I would argue that first paint and first contentful paint are also like effectively heuristics. If you say their objective is to quantify some aspect of user experience, they're less crazy heuristics, certainly. Like LCP, it does have more heuristics than would be ideal from some perspectives. But I think it makes the right trade-offs.
Yeah, I mean, those classes of APIs. Do we have any other class of APIs where I don't know, basically heuristics only? I'm thinking about it, but I can't think of it.
Any layout stuff? Are there any layout stuff?
The heuristics, right? They're like.
We have scroll anchoring, but it's not just heuristics.
Yeah, that's hard to find out.
Well, but being formally defined doesn't mean it's not based on heuristics. Like I think scroll anchoring does use heuristics to try to guess what is the content the user is looking at so that we can keep it stationary.
That's right.
Right, yeah.
Text size adjust is kind of heuristic-y, but not what's specified.
Yeah. But I think I would argue that being based on heuristics is not inherently bad.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, sure. It's not inherent, but I want to be careful just because I don't think if you're doing something that has never been done in a platform, right? You want to be careful whether that's the right thing to do.
Yep.
I think.
In my opinion, we're providing a toolbox, and if this new piece of data covers an area that wasn't measurable before for some websites, then it has value, and it's up to them to decide how to combine with other things to measure their own users' performance.
Yeah,
what matters is it different often enough for enough websites to be justifiable.
Yeah, and the trick is making sure that we don't say, well, more tools in the toolbox is good, therefore we should stick in 1,000 different screwdrivers. We do need.
Yeah, that's my other point. Are there other things we could be measuring? Sorry, that would have more value. So that's something to think about in more broader terms. But I think there needs to be some kind of threshold we set for how many origins is this different for, and so that does that become useful, and should we pursue this in a lot of detail, putting a lot of efforts into turning that into a spec, or is it something that has some value, but that, for example, doesn't need to go through all the efforts to turn into a standard? So like I think what we're missing here is how do we evaluate the usefulness of this new tool? Besides the fact that it makes sense, like you have to look at how often it's useful and how much value it has compared to other things we're pursuing.
Yeah, because I mean, so the first contentful paint, right? That's kind of clear cut because that's literally the first paint of the page with some content in it, right? That's a pretty kind of clear cut. Whereas this one, it measures like the text painting and images, but then excludes the image, got removed.
What's not clear about first contentful paint? The definition is clear cut. What's not clear is that it correlates to user experience in a meaningful way.
Yes, yes, that's the problem, right? Yeah.
And we know that it doesn't.
But with this one, like what if there was some website in which, let's say Tumblr, right? Like Tumblr, background image on the Tumblr is kind of important, right? Like maybe they want to have a largest contextful paint with the background taken account. Should we add a new metric that has like a first contextful paint with the background? Like it gets, I think I don't want to really say like a naysayer on every API just because you use the heuristics and so forth, but I think there's some sort of question there about like why this heuristic, right? Why not other heuristic? That because it's a heuristic, and also because we don't seem to have a very clear-cut metric by which we can judge this heuristic, right? That makes me kind of uneasy because I believe that you have that due diligence to come up with the best you could. I believe that, but I think the question is like, is it like, can we come up with some objective metric to say, okay, this is good because it fits certain criteria, or like?
Yeah, I think in this case they've done the work. Like or I think there's agreement that speed index is a pretty okay metric in general. We don't have really many better metrics, and if this correlates with the speed metric, then that's some evidence that this is an okay heuristic.
I'm kind of arguing against myself here. But what data do we have that speed index is good?
Yeah, we don't either. We don't know that speed index is any good. To me, speed index is the poster child of engineers came up what they think performance should be, without asking users at any point in time, does that make you happy? It's cool, people understand it, but it's never been tested against user perceived performance, and like that I know of. So in that sense, yeah, it's kind of a fool's errand to pursue reproducing speed index in run settings.
Don't agree with that claim. I think speed index, certainly knowing the amount of effort that some of the teams have gone at Google and worked with customers to improve their performance based on speed index, it had direct impact on revenue and perception.
Probably indirectly, like it was a decent proxy, but speed index itself has not been proven
These are proxies for user experience.
Proxies. We're not claiming that it's measuring the real target, right? It's a way to determine whether you've improved like what really matters, which is like the user experience and conversions and stuff like that.
Like so here's an interesting thought experiment, right? Like for example, the idea that we want to remove the image that was involved in one of the first contextful paint, but then got removed. One question I like to ask is, okay, if you remove that behavior to not take into account that data got removed, how much of the web page would that affect? Right? Like, because I think the thing I'm hung up on is it really this current heuristic is pretty complex. How much of that complexity is really truly needed to create this process?
And we can definitely surface more data there. That particular heuristic about removing or ignoring content that was removed is a trade-off between splash screens and carousels. We see a bunch of carousel cases where the carousel image shows up and then it rotates off and the element gets removed. Whereas really that was the largest contentful paint. But we were finding the splash screen cases seem to be significantly more common from the carousel cases. We will have some kind of anecdotal data based on that, but all of that has to be kind of manual film strip investigation because we can't automate that process.
Also, on the front of speed index, speed index is explicitly bad in both cases.
Right.
So having LCP be better in one of them is, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, if we had at some point a better heuristic that can distinguish between the two, yeah, but it's.
Yeah, I mean, I guess another question is, let's say we did spec what we currently have in spec as a heuristic for this idea, right? If in the future we find out the page behave differently, do we update the heuristics to be better?
And we've actually had some discussion on this internally, even around things like we updated what timestamp we use for first paint and first contentful paint.
And that caused some confusion.
Right.
And like maybe we should actually be versioning these things somehow, but it gets pretty gnarly.
Yeah, it could be great. I mean, for example, the web forms added as API to control when we fall back. They fall back to the system form versus waiting to load and then using the fallback, the different fonts and stuff like that. I mean, if we spec this thing before those things happen, we may have respect of the different timing, and when once those API became available, we have we might have done. I think this raises a lot of questions about that, right? And that's I wish there was a way we can avoid those questions.
Yeah, I suspect that there isn't, but if we can find one, I would be very excited.
It's fair to say, though, that there's a lot of foundational work in terms of performance and how web pages are loaded, that if any company funds and goes after would be helpful for web performance, for how we all think about it. Is that a fair statement? Yeah, so we're all theorizing about what feels good to users in terms of performance. And it turns out we have good corollary data about when you change certain types of things, about whether users will perceive that well. But like I was just pulling on the Bing website, the background image off, and my core question was, well, if I do or do not count the background image, will that feel faster or slower to a user? I don't know. I'm a performance expert and I can't give an answer. So, and this is the work that Gilles is trying to do. So these APIs are good. These measurements are good. They have correlated to engagement in dollars. But
I think we need more systematic studies about engagement in dollars. Those are the two things that are very difficult for me to get. I cannot measure engagement well because we don't track our users, and we don't have revenue dollars. And so I'm stuck with asking people what they think, which is another way to go at this. But it'd be very nice if there was more systematic study of these new metrics by people who can correlate it to engagement in dollars, which I cannot do with just Wikipedia.
In fact, in the last face-to-face, didn't somebody point out that some user had to slow down the page because the ad were not showing up fast enough?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That
was ad speed at Google.
Yeah, that was kind of mind-boggling. At the same time, it would mean that the business metric might be completely opposite of what users want.
I think in aggregate, I hope that's not the case.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. So,
Yeah, so I think
on sites that have ad revenue, that is not an uncommon thing to have happen. That a change that actually benefits the user will cause a decrease in monetization. So this is, again, why monetization is one thing, and the second piece is how do users feel. Unfortunately, we don't have a feeling meter on the browser. So.
And when we've tried, we put some effort into asking users how they feel, and our conclusion was that they feel completely random things most of the time.
So, they feel angry over mother-in-law.
Yeah.
In my study, it wasn't random, but there was a lot of overlap. So there were surprises about people being unhappy about what we would consider very fast page loads. And so I think this is not something to be discarded immediately. It probably means that they might have been frustrated by something we could not measure right now, or that we don't measure in my case. And so, having a very fast first page and people still being upset doesn't mean that people are stupid. It might mean that something else is going on that we're not aware of.
I suspect for a particular investigation, we just had insufficient data volume and the signal is quite noisy.
So we're collecting 24,000 survey responses per day now. So that allowed us to see some much more fine-grained variations in people's opinions. And it seems to be making more sense than you would think. For example, in the past 4 months, I've seen the happiness increase on mobile on Spanish Wikipedia. I was just studying this specifically. Spanish Wikipedia is one of the ones where we get the most data. And my conclusion to this was that this is mostly due to their devices improving significantly. We've seen that device memory shifted a lot in that time. So people upgrading their devices and they seem to be getting happier about the experience because in that time frame, we didn't make huge improvements to Wikipedia that would account for this. And so now it's getting to the point where I can measure like sub% changes in people's opinion. And it does make sense. It does progress in a way that is logical. So I think it's worth doing this, but if you do it, you have to do it on a large scale. Otherwise, like you said, there's too much noise for you to capture. Like, I did this and people's opinion changed. It's very difficult to do unless you're capturing a lot of responses.
So is Wikipedia's largest contentful paint a good proxy for this type of data then?
I didn't try largest contentful paint. The reason I'm not pursuing more of those is because already first paint and first contentful paint are almost identical for us, and so element timing was more interesting for us. So I looked into element timing and looking at the time it takes for the top image in the article. It wasn't suddenly magical. It was about the same as the correction we got for first paint and first contentful paint. So it was maybe slightly better, but not to the point that I could declare, oh, this is awesome, we have to switch to this. So it was okay, but it was not a revolution. Mostly because most of the time it's the same as first paint for us, because you tend to have the top of the page appear all at once, including the top image, which is usually a fairly small thumbnail in terms of file weight. So yeah, and again, I don't think that Wikipedia is the right audience for this particular API. So I'm not judging it. I'm saying it's not useful for us, but it's probably useful for other people. But yes, please do studies if you can. Tell all your pals running websites for your companies, please study more. Like there's a really clear lack in science in this, and it's not just asking people. It's in general, like very, very few studies. I would say there's probably 2-3 academic papers that come out every year about web performance. It's too little.
So I don't know if you folks are aware that there's WPOstats.com. It's just a community resource word.
Yeah, but not with verifiable. Often, like I like that website, but the problem is data is not released, and you have to trust people's claims, and maybe they had a mistake in the way they set up their experiments. It's kind of difficult to trust all of these claims as value compared to a peer-reviewed paper. So it's great that people are sharing those stories, but I'm always skeptical when I see them, because it's very easy to make a mistake when you study those things. And then you're not going to publish a follow-up blog post saying that you messed up, your claims in the previous story. So,
yeah, but what you're basically asking for academic papers produced by commercial companies who have actual users.
Well, not necessarily going to that extent, but I don't hear enough stories of even lab studies of looking into those new metrics to figure out if it correlates well to people's impressions. Like for instance, like the metrics I'm most excited about in the new stuff we're working on are things that are completely unrelated to things that we were measuring before, like event timing or layout stability. Those are great. Like in my mind, studying web performance is like we're trying to study the elephants. We're a bunch of blind people, and if we focus again on something that has to do with the first render, we studied the leg of the elephant really well. We know that leg in every dimension, but there's a whole other part of the animal that we've never looked at. And so I think we have to think of really huge areas of the user experience that might be correlated to performance that we're not measuring at all right now. I think this is where the biggest gains are in the toolbox. I'm sure it's of value to other people to study the initial rendering more, but like, for example, one of the main findings of our research was that the best correlating metric was load event end, which is as old school and basic as it gets. But I think what this is hinting at is, for example, the focus on above the fold is probably outdated nowadays. Like if people react to the full load time, including a bunch of images that they don't see, which in the case of Wikipedia can be a lot of stuff below the fold, and apparently this correlates better than the first image that they get, then that means that people pay a lot more attention to the whole page, maybe they scroll sooner than we think, etc. So like focusing on this initial rendering of stuff at the top, I think it might be a bit of a like old-fashioned way to look at this. And I would be much more excited if we were suddenly measuring something that was entirely new, like a part of the user experience that's not covered by any of these things. I'm sure that we kind of it's like optimizing what we're already measuring to move from FCP to LCP, but we're probably missing the forest for trees. It's like when I see people who have very fast first paint and they're upset, and a lot of them, I really wonder what's going on. And unfortunately, I can't go through the screen and ask them, and I don't have the resources to do more lab studies and things like that. Like we have to like chip in. Like you guys have a lot of resources to work on standards, but I don't see that effort being made to study those new metrics in a more rigorous manner to figure out, does that really help? Does that really get closer to what people are experiencing? And really looking at the whole picture of the user experience, not just from the browser's perspective, which tends to be like, I think the thinking that we tend to have is we go from what the browser can expose, and we can work our way back to the user and figure out, well, we can measure this without too much effort. It's quite cheap. And then figure out, is that good for measuring the user experience, instead of going the other way, which is figuring out what matters to the users, and then working our way back to the browser and seeing what we can measure there. Like that journey on the other side doesn't seem to really happen that much. It's a lot of guesswork trying to, like, I see a lot of people, like there's a lot of discussion today about what's important and what's not, but without studying people, it's very difficult to figure that out, in my opinion. So if you guys can push for some research, I think it'd be great. And we have more clarity when we have those discussions next time about what's truly important.
I think that brings up the interesting aspect, which is that with this largest contentful does that number correlate with either load event or the first contentful paint or any other existing metric? And if there are cases where this metric does not correlate with any of them, right? Because if that's the case, this metric might be useful. Although then in those cases it does not correlate with any of them, we have to also study, was this uncorrelated data useful in the first place too? But
Yeah,
that would be interesting there.
And we have done a bunch of internal research correlating it against various metrics. I don't think we did correlate against onload in particular, but that is certainly the kind of research that we do, and we have not sufficiently made public, because making it public takes an awful lot of time. But we should probably be doing a better job of that.
I mean, in fact, I don't think you necessarily even have to report the individual pages, right? If you can tell us the number about, hey, these things correlate with the whatever correlation, it'll be probably good enough.
Yeah.
Well, I like the rigor in the Wikipedia study, frankly, and I'm a little disappointed that, like, that's the standard that I'm holding, and it's lacking right now. So, I mean, Google certainly has resources. It certainly has academics. Like, yeah, I'm seconding Jill's plea here. Like a little bit more rigor here.
Confused as to what exactly, like, are we nitpicking on a specific set of heuristics?
No, it's just like, is this useful to people outside of Google?
People outside of Google.
So is this the kind of thing, like, if it's not applicable to every website, should it be in a standard? Like, there's some questions here.
I think the question is it useful to people, and does it correlate well with user experience? Aren't quite the same question. Like, is it useful to people? We can see if people adopt it and get it some adoption numbers, and that could prove that, like, at least people think it's useful for them. But I don't think that would make you happy, right?
No, I mean, like Jill, there's a standard of rigor in what the perceived performance that Wikipedia is trying to do that no one else is matching, including Mozilla. And I think that is the standard that this group should aspire to.
And it's really unclear to me how we could do that. Looking at a single website you control, there are a lot fewer variables.
Well, Google controls a couple of very high-profile websites, correct?
This is true. I don't think I would be particularly convinced by data from all of Google's properties. Like, I'm not going to claim that Google properties are representative of the web as a whole.
Also, if we told you, yeah, this is great for Google Docs, so you should totally implement it, is that a convincing argument or not? Like,
well, no, because that also doesn't have any rigor.
Well, if you're an SPA, it helps with your decision making, I think, because you can relate to the way that app is set up. It's better than nothing. Currently, it's no information about which websites it's useful for. So yes, it's not great if it's just Google, but then, if everybody chips in, maybe you'll have a Google website, maybe you have a Microsoft website. And then, once you have 2, 3 big properties that have nothing to do with each other, who all say that this is useful, then this is a very big signal for people. To a degree, when you say, look at adoption, to a degree, we kind of drive adoption with the stuff that this group releases. So if we, it's like whatever we release, people are gonna be excited about because it's new and there's gonna be some adoption about it. Maybe the adoption is more how easy it is to implement. And in a way, we might be steering the entire web performance community in the wrong direction because we decided to release this because it was cool or whatever, and everybody jumps on it because it's easy to implement compared to other APIs. But it doesn't mean that we're actually solving the thing that the entire community should be solving.
I definitely agree with that. I also think a lot of these APIs, so LargestContentfulPaint, for example, is not targeting domains like Google, right? Like it's targeting domains that are not willing to put the effort in to do explicit instrumentation. And I think the level of complexity that you tend to see in applications that complexity of the app is correlated with whether or not you'd be willing to do explicit annotation. And so taking a bunch of complicated applications that would be willing to do explicit annotation is not necessarily going to be representative. It could get us some data, and we should do a better job correlating with Google properties, but I'm not sure that would be sufficient.
Yeah, I think the first principal question here is that if we added this API, would it solve a class of problems in websites that currently encounter, like performance problems? I think that's the question. And I think it will be good to get some evidence.
Yeah, and we can certainly get evidence that web developers think it will solve their problems. That's different from it actually solving their problems.
Right, yeah.
I mean, so anecdotally, we could try to gather success stories.
So for example, the memory API, right, about heap size, like there was the commentary about how the Gmail expands your memory leaks using that API in Chrome. That's a very compelling website, right? I mean, it's compelling evidence because Gmail is one of the top websites, and a lot of people use it, and being able to fix the leak on that website is a very compelling showcase to say, okay, this API works, right? Like if we had something similar to that story, that would be a very compelling.
So anecdotal success story.
Well, I think more than anecdotal, like at the end of the day, what we're looking for is a way to measure, like, does the user feel like this website loaded fast? And
I don't actually think that the user feeling like it loaded fast is necessarily that correlated with whether or not they behaved as though it loaded fast, but maybe I'm nitpicking.
Well, that's nitpicking. But and to do that, we're taking a heuristic-based approach. And we don't have the information, the numbers to say, if we tweak this heuristic a little bit like this, would that make it a little bit better or a little bit worse?
I mean,
we just have, it's probably something good. I don't know.
So we have, I don't remember how rigorous we were on LCP specifically around this general approach, but one thing we've done is take a bunch of film strips, rank those pages by hand, and then test a couple of different metrics and see how good they are at reconstructing the ordering that we did manually.
Yeah, but the problem with this is like you're looking at the loading experience in the way that the user never experiences. Nobody looks at the film strip.
Yep.
And there's been a lot of studies, like the lazy academic studies, where they show people videos like side by side, and you pick which one's the fastest loading. But like that never happens in real life. And that's not what influences people's behavior. So it's kind of, again, the methodology really matters there. So it's a good intent, but you have to acknowledge the fact that it's really disconnected from the user experience.
Gilles, so you mentioned 24,000 user surveys a day. How, are you asking users to fill out a survey?
There's a micro survey that shows up on the page that asks them, did this page load fast? Yes, no, I don't know. This is what we're asking for 24,000 times a day. And this is, think about, for example, apps like Skype or even Google Meet. It's very common for them at the end of the experience to ask you, like, please rate this call, was it good, blah, 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 blah. And this has been used for many years for them to optimize their codecs and, the general smoothness of the experience. Like, it's not such a far-fetched idea to do this a bit more systematically. And this only represents something like 1 in every 1,000 page views for us. And that means that the person doesn't get asked that question like more than a couple of times a month or whatever. I mean, maybe even less than that if they come often to the website. So it can be done in a very soft way and still collect a lot of data if you're big enough, which I think a lot of people around this table are.
theoretically, browsers could also have some sort of a survey-based UI thing. I have no idea how to pull that off.
You could definitely be doing the same thing. Yeah, absolutely.
Alternatively, an extension, but that would give you biased users. Yeah.
It's something to think about. Look, I see it as it's not perfect either. Of course, you're asking people directly the question. It's not the same as the way they behave, although that could be studied separately. It is covering an area that we're not measuring at all right now. No API gives you people's opinion. And so that's an extra signal that's very strong and very interesting to compare to others, not just in the context of evaluating APIs. Imagine having this at the browser level and it being exposed in Crux. And then people can do a lot of data mining there and compare, have the human signal in addition to all the other stuff. You can even look at competitors and figure out, are people happy with the competitors in terms of performance, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, I think it's definitely an idea to consider seriously because the human signal is missing here.
The App Store for the web. You need to rate them.
Yeah, no.
So I think the general observation of gathering user input on their experience is an interesting one. Whether that's better or not than what other metrics businesses use, engagement, length of sessions, conversions, whatever, is unclear entirely. So depending on whose side you're looking at, browsers metrics and what we optimize for in terms of engagement may be different from site engagement, is different from the business unit of the site. There's many different angles on this.
There's also a difference between gaps that you can perceive as a user and gaps that I think you mentioned is gaps that nevertheless drive behavior. So we found that search latency is now well within the noise of user perception. And yet we can still see behavioral changes for 50 to 100 millisecond improvements in latency.
Yeah. There's something about getting out of the way of muscle memory that drives engagement, and it's weird, but right.
Yeah, but people don't necessarily know.
They can't feel it. They can't say it. They can't feel it. But
yeah.
Although we may actually get better data by looking at revealed preference in behavior.
And you also have to look at it over time. Like, yes, if you move things around, people will click on ads a bit more, but how long does that last? And if you're only looking at snapshots in time, then you'll get a very different story as what's the evolution over 6 months or a month, whatever. Like those effects tend to wear off when it's just shuffling things around or changing the experience a little bit so that the muscle memory stops working.
I feel like we have discussed this.
Yeah.
I also feel like we don't have as clear next steps as I would like.
Yeah.
I can say what my opinion is. Benjamin probably has a different opinion. I think if you share those film strips and the correlation with speed index, then already just a great bunch. Let's say the data that you promised or suggested would be very useful. I'm not making any demands. Yeah, the higher scientific rigor that Benjamin requested would be amazing to strive to, but it's really, really hard. And yeah, there's not much we can do about that, I think. So that's my opinion.
I think the data you mentioned about like correlation between load time being, moving, if they're moving at the same time with the other events, that would be also very useful. That would be like a one metric of usefulness.
Can you repeat that?
So the idea is, so you have a load event and DOM content loaded and like first then full paint, right, and the page visibility events and so forth. Let's say on like any given page, like let's say one of them move to later time, one of them move earlier time. Did this largest contextful paint move the same direction? Did it move,
Yeah.
And so because if it turns out that like largest context-free correlates with some other events most of the time, or like you can combine some events to figure out, right? Then maybe not as useful. Whereas if that timing is a sort of distinct, uncorrelated, as in like covariance with other metric, other events are not that high, then that's it. That's an interesting thing, right? Like as in like, yeah, like, is it independent random variable is really what we ask like this. No, that can be true. Like that it obviously not. But I'm saying is it added? Does it add more value?
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay. And with that, I think we can call it a day.
8:30 tomorrow?
8:30 tomorrow, or with this 9 down for 9.
9 tomorrow.
Yoav, can you publish the link to the YouTube video of the recording? I'd like to watch what happened when I was asleep before tomorrow, if possible.
I will do that as soon as I can, yes. It's not yet,
thank you.
I need to upload it and...
Yeah, but it'd be good if I can watch it by the time the session starts tomorrow morning.
Oh, I will try to do that.
If you can, it'd be great. If you can't, I understand, All right, thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
It's on the agenda document.
Microsoft did a bunch of research on. Online performance. How did that research?